So Steve Harvey. Outside of this, I'm the managing director of a healthcare company called Partnered Health. We have around 3,000 staff all around Australia, so that keeps me pretty busy these days. But and it's a long way from my days in netball, which were back in the 80s and the 90s, and they were great days. I was a member of the state team here, as captain of the state team for a number of years. Played in the Australian team from 1987 through to about 1995, and yeah, lots of amazing times back then. Yeah, I was a basketballer and had been playing basketball all of my life and out at North Adelaide Rockets, and a friend of our family was playing men's netball, and they needed a person to fill in. There was some absences for a game, so he asked would I join them for a couple of games. So I went out and played and thoroughly loved it, really enjoyed it. And it was at a time when there was the National Club Championships, and one of the clubs that was going to the National Club Championships, a team called Aztecs, invited me to join them to go to Geelong for that championship, and I think from there I was hooked. That would have been around 1985, I suspect, and from that day on, I never played basketball again and played netball for the rest of my time playing the sport. Loved it. There was a period of time when the sport was really growing back then, or starting to really take off, and I decided to join the committee. So I was the vice president. It's probably the safest position to have someone like me. It's the easiest position on the board, I thought, and so I was the vice president at a time when the sport, I thought, was really evolving and expanding. I felt like, particularly as we started to play more, you could see that the sport had a future. And I recall there was a pivotal time in Melbourne when we had an under-17, the first under-17. And it gave me recollections. We were the first under-21 team in 1988 when we travelled to Tasmania. And it felt like you were really starting something when we were the first under-21 team that won the championship that year. And then not long after that, we had the first under-17 team. And you could see that there was, for the first time, people joining the sport that weren't just coming in from other sports like football or basketball. These were people who really just wanted to play netball. And you felt at that time that there was this opportunity to grow something that people could then play from all ages. It wasn't just something people did as a fill-in or outside of football. So that was a really important time for us. We then started to get involved in coaching. I coached both men and women, or boys and girls, at Oakdale, and thoroughly enjoyed coaching and seeing the next generation of boys come through that weren't just coming from other sports. I think it was a really interesting time because, and it was a time when there weren't things like social media. And one of the really amazing things that I see now that netball's able to produce is great information and stories around what's going on with the sport through the relevant social media activities. You can just see all of the promotion of the sport, which we didn't have that luxury back in the 80s and 90s. And so we knew that things were building, but there were these stories that were emerging where other states were starting to play netball. We didn't know that, it was at the time. And so each nationals that would come around each year, there would be a new state added. We'd had a team from Northern Territory or a team from Queensland, and these stories that you were hearing were suddenly starting to come to life, where there were other states that you had heard were playing netball, finally made their way through to the national championships. And I think it was really important for us to then know that the sport, what we were doing in South Australia, was happening all across the country. And I think it validated all the things we were doing. It gave the sport great integrity, and then the same thing started to happen internationally when we got the opportunity to go to New Zealand, and then New Zealand coming here. And of course it's far, far bigger now, perhaps bigger than we'd ever dreamed of when we were playing against New Zealand. So without doubt, we felt like we were building something. At the time, when you're in your 20s, you probably live for that day and the excitement of the next championship that was coming around or the next game that you were playing, and not really thinking a lot about the sport that you were building, hopefully for the future. But I think now, looking back, those moments were really important, and you could see the evolution of the sport really occurring. There was a competition. So back in the 80s and 90s, most of the early adoption of the sport was mixed netball. There were mixed netball competitions, particularly in the indoor cricket centres and things at the time. Eventually they formed, and this is to the credit of people like Corbsey and Corbett and Cape Waterlesi, who built the first men's competition, and it was played at Para Hills on outdoor courts at Para Hills on Bridge Road, and there were quite a number of teams that played there and that were forming, and that was the first genuine men's competition that then fed the state teams from there. That grew, but continued to play out there. Eventually the sport, and I think it was a really formative time of the sport, moved indoors, and because it gave the sport the opportunity to really improve. We could play later and grow, and so we moved to the Underdale campus and still had a number of teams. And the thing then, interestingly, from the announcement of this week, we had a couple of teams that were part of the South Australian Netball Association women's teams. I can remember playing for Oakdale and playing for Matrix during that period, and they were often linked to the clubs, for example, where Ian Corbett may have been involved in, and Ian was able to convince them to create a men's version of their team. And so we had some really strong teams then, and so that's how it evolved. We were growing the teams, moved to a large central indoor venue, and but it was still a centralised competition. Well, I've watched it, and particularly looking at things like the social media and the exposure that the sport has now, it's amazing. I love the fact that the representation is across all ages, because I think that gives the sport lots of longevity in future. I love the fact that the sport is the skills are incredible now. If we think when we played back 30 years ago, nearly all of the players came to netball from a different sport. Were either footballers or basketballers. So you had this sort of crazy skill set of people sort of playing half netball, half basketball. There were players that were trying to slam dunk the ball all the time and stuff because they'd come from basketball, which was never positive. There was players that tried to learn to defend by jumping well above the height of the ring to block shots and create different strategies. But now what I see is that the netball players today have come from netball. That's their sport. They're not a footballer trying to play netball or a basketballer trying to play netball. So therefore, the skills are markedly better. They are not trying to learn the game on the go. And so I think that's what the amazing thing about it now is they genuinely love the sport. There's a long future for them. There's a whole range of opportunities for them to pursue that we perhaps didn't have back then, and their skills are markedly better. See, look, you're going back, it's over 30 years now. Look, without doubt, the first tour of New Zealand in 1987 was quite amazing. We were the first Australian team to tour internationally, and we came together and travelled there, and it was just an amazing opportunity to represent our country. We thought we were really onto something, and we were really well received in New Zealand. At times it was hostile. I can remember some really interesting times in Wellington, playing in this crazy outdoor venue that was like a bowl, and there was 1,000 people just yelling and screaming. It was quite amazing. So that tour was I think an amazing time, and I think the final would be the national championship we won in 1995. I was captain of the South Australian team, and I'd missed twice winning that championship by a goal or two on two occasions over many years, and then to finally win it in 1995 by one goal here in South Australia against Tasmania was probably the highlight. at what was then the end of my career after many years. So there were just amazing memories like that throughout that time. I played in 1989, it was my 21st birthday, and we played a test match in Sydney that night, and I still remember it was a great way to celebrate the 21st with the New Zealand players that night. So long time ago, but great memories. Oh, look, so many players. There's a number that come to mind that we played a lot against. There were two players from Victoria, that Chris Carroll, who you would know, Steve. Chris is, I can remember in Tasmania, he was there as a 14-year-old playing in the Victorian Open team. I recall, I think his mum may have been the coach of the team, Betty, and everyone was amazed at the skills of this young 14 or 15-year-old Chris Carroll. He was an amazing player, obviously played a lot with him and more against him. And another fellow from Victoria named Terry Corey. Terry was their centre wing attack for many years, was in a number of Australian teams, and was an amazing midfield or centre court player. But what I love at the moment, particularly watching the players that play a position, I was a goal attack and goal shooter at times, would be terrible at any other position, I think. When I watch the players that play those positions, the goalies now, obviously there's an attachment to that, the skills that they now have, their ability to, how they can shoot, how they can move around the court, how they can create position that we weren't able to do. I mean, we were really fortunate. We had Corbs as our coach for all those years, both at club and state and national level. So we were getting great coaching. We even got the opportunity to go to the Institute of Sport and things like that to train. We trained against the greatest players in South Australia, women's sport at the time, from Contacts and Garville every single week. But we never had the skills that the players had today. They have such amazing skills and far greater than we ever had back then. So I don't want to name a player, but I certainly acknowledge the positions that I was playing. They're outstanding players. So this jumper here was the first touring team to New Zealand as a player in 1987. You can see they lovely gold colours. That was our trip to Wellington and Auckland, my first trip overseas. This one is the jumper we wore as the first under-21 state team, 1988 for Tasmania. We won the championship that year as the first South Australian under-21 team, playing against, that was the B grade, so we played against the B grade teams from the other states. Great trip, great memories. The first state tracksuits from that early era. This one's 1988, and we used to, rather than get a new tracksuit each year, we would receive a little patch to sew on. That one's 1988 under 21s. That saved money for all the players. We could reuse our tracksuits every single year, and they made sure they kept the same tracksuits. These were our first tracksuits for our first Australian tour in Australia, so that was 1989. Not the most attractive tracksuit, this one, but 1989, I wore that on my 21st birthday as we played a test match in Sydney. And that's the same playing top for that particular period, that same test match. My only last comment is, I think to the people that are involved now, if they probably don't realise what they're achieving. And when you play the sport, I look back now, and it's been, as I said, well over 30 years since I played the sport. But if I look back, I think of the things that I have been able to get in life as a result of that. And I don't mean anything materially, I mean things like the friendships that I've made, the memories that you created. My best friends today, who I still see regularly, and are from netball and from teams like the under-21 1988 team in Tasmania. And when I get together with those people on a regular basis, we still talk about those days as if they were yesterday. And so I just urge people who play today to cherish the moments that they get to play, because in 20 or 30 years' time or more, the friendships they make today and the memories they create today will still be so vivid, and they'll still talk about it like it was yesterday, but they won't realise how important that will be today. So just cherish that time. It goes quickly, and then when your time in the sport as a player is over, the memories will last forever. And I think that's for me been one of the most important things.